Woke Supremacy News.
Hi there, everyone. Welcome to Monday. It's 4 o'clock in New York. We are at the start of a critical week for the investigation into the twice impeached ex-president's handling of government documents, with potentially huge developments on the way in the ongoing court fight over that special master to review the records seized in the search of Mar-a-Lago last month. Earlier today, Donald Trump's lawyers informed Judge Eileen Cannon that they oppose the two candidates for special master proposed by DOJ, citing what they call specific reasons that they then refuse to explain, at least publicly. It comes just hours after Trump's legal team filed a motion opposing DOJ's request that investigators be allowed to work with the 100 classified documents that were found by the FBI at Trump's private residence and golf club. Trump's lawyers dismiss the criminal investigation as a document storage dispute that has spiraled out of control. The most notable aspect of their filing, Trump's lawyers tiptoeing around Trump's claim that he declassified any or all of the documents. It's a claim for which they can't and don't provide a single shred of evidence. Instead, saying this, quote, "The government has not proven these records remain classified. That issue is to be determined later." The Washington Post notes this, quote, "A section of their 21-page filing outlines the president's power to declassify documents, but does not say Trump actually declassified the material before he left office." And while Trump's lawyers would like all of us to think that this is what they say, a document storage dispute, it's worth remembering that in the court filing last week, DOJ made clear that the country's national security may very well be in jeopardy if the government loses access and time, even temporarily, to the documents that were seized. From the New York Times reporting on that, quote, DOJ said the prohibition on using those materials was hindering the intelligence community's review of the potential harm caused by the insecure storage of national security secrets, and a classification review of the materials, arguing those efforts were inextricably intertwined with the criminal investigation. On Monday, Trump's lawyers dismissed the government's claims, saying that those assertions appear to be exaggerated and that only a brief pause would be required for the special master's review to be completed. Trump's lawyers said on Friday that they expected the review to take 3 months. All eyes are now on Judge Eileen Cannon. She has until Thursday to grant DOJ's request to use the classified documents, or else DOJ will take their case to the circuit, to the appeals court. Donald Trump's latest salvo in a high-stakes legal battle over appointing a special master to review the documents seized at Mar-a-Lago is where we begin today with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. New York Times congressional reporter Luke Broadwater is back. Also joining us, Asha Rangappa, former FBI special agent for counterintelligence, now a senior lecturer and assistant dean at the Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs. Andrew Weissman is also back, former Justice Department prosecutor, a senior member of Robert Mueller's special counsel investigation, and also, lucky for us, an MSNBC legal analyst. And our friend, the former U.S. Senator and MSNBC political analyst, Claire McCaskill, is here. Let me start with you, Luke. And on the reporting of the president's objections, they seem narrow and vague at the same time.
I'm Raphael Warnock, and I approve this message.
There's one issue where Herschel Walker actually has made his position.
And clearly outing the president's legal moves as just a delay tactic, no?
Yeah, I mean, one tactic that Donald Trump and his allies have used throughout these investigations is to delay and delay and delay. And, it's definitely could be seen through one lens as that's the main function here. I think a former Attorney General Bill Barr said on Fox that he viewed this as sort of a rain delay in the middle of the investigation. But this is causing frustration. I mean, I was talking with some people on the Hill today, and they've been wanting to get a Gang of Eight briefing about these classified documents and about the national security implications therein, and that's been put on hold while this special master dispute is being ironed out. And of course, the FBI investigation is being hindered or at least slowed down somewhat. So it may well be that the Justice Department prevails in the end here, but what will the cost of that time be to the investigation and to the wheels of justice starting quickly?
So, Andrew Weissman, I don't know that I would have put on the bingo card asking you if you agree with John Yoo, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. He said this: Trump is not allowed to have the records and keep them. He can get copies, but he can't keep them away from the archives. That is settled. John Yoo told NBC News in an interview with the National Conservatism Conference. It's not whether Trump violated the law. He did. It's not whether the government had legal grounds for the search warrant. It does. The question really is whether he could be charged. And the real issue I think people on both sides should recognize is it a good use of prosecutorial discretion to charge him? My view has been if you're going to go after a president for the first time in history for violating law, it should be something more important than this, like being involved with the January 6th conspiracy. Oh, John Yoo, give us a minute, right? Andrew Weissman, we now have Bill Barr, and I'm going to play Chris Christie, too. We have Bill Barr. These are not Republicans who saw Trump for the threat that he was. These are far right-wing Republicans. This is Bill Barr, Chris Christie, John Yoo saying he broke the law and he can be charged.
Yeah, I also, so look, I agree with a lot of that statement. I don't agree with the part that is, if you're going to charge a former president, it has to be something really serious like the January 6th conspiracy. Obviously, that is really, a really serious crime. That is overthrowing a democratic election. It's hard to see something more serious than that. But here's the thing. Donald Trump is a civilian. He may be a former president. He is a person like all of us on TV right now talking to you. If we break the law, we should be held to account. There are many junior people who work in the intelligence community, who work in law enforcement, who get prosecuted for doing much less than what the former president did in Mar-a-Lago. So this idea that it's like, oh, you know what, he's kind of above the law is really, I think, just wrong-headed. I mean, either we have a system where we are all accountable to the law or we don't. And I have to say, the statement that you read, and is page 1 of Trump's brief, which is this is a mere storage dispute, is preposterous. My analogy is to, Willie Sutton saying, the fact that you found, my proceeds in my home, that's a mere storage dispute that I'm keeping, my bank robbery proceeds at home instead of at the bank. I mean, this is preposterous for the former president. I mean, to me, the filings, I think, make it very clear that there's not much of a defense if he is charged.
Well, Andrew Weissman, it also makes clear that they don't have any evidence that Trump declassified anything.
Yeah, well, as you pointed out, they go up to the line, but they don't quite cross it and say he declassified it. And the reason is that you could be charged with lying to a judge. That's 18 U.S.C. 1001 if you make that false statement. And this is where as Asha knows and Claire knows, any normal judge would bring the parties in and they'd say, what are you saying? Are you saying that you declassified it? And if so, where's the affidavit to prove that? You don't just get to make allegations in a brief. You're supposed to actually put some evidence on as to what happened. And, I don't think that's what this judge will do. She doesn't seem terribly experienced. But in a normal court of law, you don't get to just say this in a brief and not have any evidence to back it up.
And Andrew Weissman, just for anyone, I think viewers of this program know who John Yoo is, but he's the architect of all the legal memos arguing for, among other things, a legal architecture for extraordinary steps taken during the global war on terror. And he made those comments at the Conservatism Conference. It is interesting to me that Bill Barr and John Yoo and Chris Christie are speaking publicly for another day, a day perhaps in which they will be, and I hate to describe it, these people of being capable of being embarrassed or ashamed, but the way they're speaking suggests that they want to cleave themselves away from arguing that the government doesn't have the right to charge and prosecute a former president for this conduct. They just want to narrow it down to prosecutorial discretion. Is that how you read John Yoo's comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. But it's also really interesting that he is willing to say the January 6th material would be an appropriate use of discretion. And so, I think as you've mentioned, and this is really outside of my bailiwick, but as a political matter, it is very useful to have people like Bill Barr, John Yoo, Liz Cheney. I mean, people who, a minute and 32 seconds ago, all of us would be describing as hardcore Republicans, distancing themselves from what Donald Trump has been doing, both at Mar-a-Lago and in terms of trying to overthrow the presidential election. So in that vein, Asha, here's Chris Christie annihilating the executive privilege claim that Judge Eileen Cannon saw. I'm not even sure that in their first go-around Trump argued this. Here it is.
I think the Justice Department's chances are pretty good. And I think they are because some of these may be covered by executive privilege. Well, there's only one executive who can assert the privilege, and that's the one who's the current executive, Joe Biden. A previous executive can't assert his executive privilege. You're not the executive any longer. Biden will not assert executive privilege over these documents. And I think the idea that some of these documents are somehow attorney-client privilege is going to be a bit of a reach. And I think they're going to have to show, in some respect, they have a good faith basis to make that claim.
So, Asha, again, when you have the likes of Bill Barr and John Yoo and Chris Christie annihilating your lame legal arguments as lame, where do you go next?
Yeah, I would probably not be so generous to say that they care so much about prosecution. I think that this really gets to the underlying legal theory that people like John Yoo and Bill Barr have been promulgating for several decades now, which is the unitary executive, which was articulated just now by Chris Christie, that all executive power rests in the president. This has justified so many actions and assertions of presidential power that what Trump is actually claiming undercuts that. It is slicing and dicing up the executive branch where they can be at cross purposes and all diced up, and even a former president can assert a claim against it. So I think that what they're trying to do is preserve this conservative legal theory, which gives the president expansive power, more so than trying to, protect or trying to turn against Trump specifically. It's just an absurd legal argument. And I agree that it's not going to hold up in court because you have proponents of that unitary executive throughout the conservative judiciary. Unfortunately, maybe Aileen Cannon is not well versed on that, but I think that the Department of Justice has a good claim to make moving forward.
Asha, let me show you one more former member of Trump's executive branch. This is Jeffrey Berman, the former U.S. attorney for SDNY, talking about what he would have done with a case like this.
It was an extraordinary revelation by the Department of Justice that Donald Trump and those around Donald Trump were being criminally investigated, not just for the mishandling of classified documents, but for obstruction of the subpoena requiring production of those classified documents. That is a very, very serious charge. If the Southern District of New York had that charge, it would have our highest priority, and we would be moving on it very quickly. And you can see in all of the Department of Justice's filings in that case, there's an urgency to move forward. And I can see that, and I believe it's entirely justified given the seriousness of the crimes.
So, Asha, this is a little different than that philosophical bend that Barr and you and probably Christie have about the government, the sort of strength of the executive. This is someone who stared at cases and had to decide whether to move forward with them. And what he homes in on here is the obstruction of the subpoena. And it, again, annihilates the Trump argument that this is a, quote, document storage dispute that has spiraled out of control. That might have been the case in February of 2021. Or in January of 2022, and the archives was working nicely to try to get everything back. But that certainly wasn't the case once Trump was in receipt of a grand jury subpoena.
That's right. Nothing that Trump has filed in court so far, all of these changing defenses, this idea that the latest defense being that he actually categorized these as personal records, which make them his, and they can, I guess they're sort of declassified. He's not really saying that, but that's why they're allowed to be at Mar-a-Lago. None of these are actually, they're not great defenses on their own, and they're not going to hold up, but they also don't address the obstruction part, which is the most problematic part for Trump, in my opinion, because throughout this entire timeline, he's been acting as though he was complying with the government, certifying that he had returned all these documents, and then it turns out that he did it. And I don't know how he gets around it, except by perhaps trying to obfuscate the legal issues, as he's done here somewhat successfully with this particular judge. But I don't know how he's going to get around the obstruction of justice part, because that's pretty cut and dry in terms of what he certified to the Department of Justice and what they found at Mar-a-Lago after.
It also, Claire, goes back to his clear intent to hang on to something that he was informed over and over again wasn't his. And the objection on Trump's part to the national security review in some ways raises the most questions about why he won't turn it over and why he doesn't want the national security review to go on. It would appear that if he actually thought there wasn't any big deal in what he took, he'd say, go ahead, examine it. You'll see I didn't do any harm.
Typically, if you file a pleading with the court, you put your best foot forward. And this pleading, this document that his lawyers filed, once again, plays fast and loose with both the facts and the law. Here's what it didn't say. It didn't say why he took them. As has been pointed out, it didn't say that he had declassified them. It did say, and this is a joke, I mean, this is just a cold stone joke, that somehow national defense documents were personal to him. I mean, for the lawyers to assert that, I'm embarrassed for them. And they are, and Andrew points out something really important here, and I think it's really important that we dwell on it just for a second, Nicole. These lawyers are having to walk a tightrope, because if they plead in court what Trump has been saying out of court, there is all kinds of legal liability they have, and that Trump has. What the DOJ needs to do, and what this judge needs to do, is tell them to put up or shut up. They need to actually swear in an affidavit some of the things that they are kind of, nibbling around the edges on. They need to come into court and show the evidence that these were declassified, or some evidence as to why they would ever, in any scenario, consider national defense documents that are highly secret and classified personal to the guy who we now know wanted to refuse to even leave the White House after he was defeated.
Claire, let me show you something that your former colleague, Senator Mark Warner, said about why a briefing for the Intel committees is so important.
Let's remember what's at stake. And I don't know what's in these documents, but if these documents contain human intelligence, people's lives could be lost if that's exposed. If it's signals intelligence, things that we've invested years of working on could be destroyed. If it's intelligence that comes from some of our allies, we talk about how we're working with the British in terms of supporting the Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. If that information that is shared amongst allies was somehow exposed in these documents, that's why getting to the bottom of this and making a damage assessment, the DOJ effort, we don't have purview over that, but the damage assessment to our intelligence capabilities is critical that we have.
It seems that as a legal matter, this is where DOJ has aggressively argued that a special master completely jeopardizes the ability to do just this, to continue with this intel community review of compromised sources, compromised methods, compromised programs. We saw in the subpoena all of the different classifications that were on the materials, hoarded, taken, and then lied about returning at Mar-a-Lago. Claire, how would you counsel your intelligence community former colleagues?
Well, they may have to be patient, because I think the priority here is preserving what they must preserve at DOJ for possible prosecution, as long as the defense, security, intelligence community is having a chance to adequately review these documents. There needs to be some oversight here, but it may not be immediate. I get why they want it immediately, but there's a lot of people in that intelligence community that, frankly, have not shown their ability to stand up to Donald Trump and his nonsense. So, and the other weird thing about this, and this was talked about by another member of the panel, you know, the court seems to be dancing with executive privilege and not understanding that you can't say, well, there's executive privilege maybe here that would allow Trump to hold on to these documents. But by the way, in another part of the executive branch, you can look at them. I mean, it's either executive or it isn't. It either belongs to the government or it doesn't. And her trying to bend this thing like a pretzel in order to placate Trump and his supporters just frankly makes her look silly.
All right, no one's going anywhere. When we come back, Luke Broadwater's Byline is on some incredible new reporting about how Donald Trump's conduct puts his own lawyers at risk. One joke going around is that MAGA actually means making attorneys get attorneys. We'll have that story next. Plus, the ex-president's problems are getting worse in that other major investigation from DOJ. One of his biggest backers, enablers, architects, top aide Stephen Miller was served with a grand jury subpoena in the January 6th probe. What he might be telling prosecutors, that and what we are learning today about those congressional public hearings that start back up again later. We are back with the panel. Luke, you and Mike Schmidt reported this over the weekend. For Trump's lawyers, legal exposure comes with the job. The story went on to say a dark joke has begun circulating among lawyers following the many legal travails of former President Trump. MAGA actually stands for making attorneys get attorneys. Time after time, his attorneys have been asked to testify as witnesses to potential crimes or evaluated as possible criminal conspirators themselves. Last week, a Justice Department filing revealed that Trump's lawyers had misled federal investigators about whether he had handed over to the Justice Department all the classified documents he took from the White House when he left office. That raised questions about whether the lawyers, Mr. Evan Corcoran and Christina Bobb, could be prosecuted themselves and might ultimately be forced to become witnesses against their client. It started almost immediately with Don McGahn spending 30 hours with Robert Mueller's very able and skilled, and at least it appeared protective investigators who was reported by your paper ushered McGahn in and out of a loading dock. But what's amazing is that people keep signing up. I mean, do they think Michael Cohen's checks to porn stars are a fluke?
Well, yeah. So Mike Schmidt and I took a deep dive over the weekend in what's really been an extraordinary month of blowback against Trump attorneys. There have been two attorneys who have been named, Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman, just recently as targets or potential targets in criminal investigations. Then you had a slew of subpoenas that went out, including to some Trump lawyers in more criminal investigations. And then 17 lesser-known attorneys, all connected to Trump, had ethics complaints filed against them with either the state courts or the state bar just in the last few weeks. And what we've seen is that a bunch of these lawyers now are having to get their own lawyers, including Christina Bobb, who was one of the lawyers who signed that statement to the Justice Department, falsely indicating that all the classified material had been transferred back to the National Archives, when we know that wasn't true now. So we are seeing a lot of blowback on these attorneys. And I was talking with the gentleman who is taking the lead in filing some of these complaints against them. And he said it's his goal to make sure that the next time Rudy Giuliani goes around asking a lawyer to sign on to a frivolous lawsuit or to lie about election fraud or try to mislead a judge about election fraud, that they're going to say no, that there will be enough blowback against this type of behavior that fewer attorneys will be encouraged to be involved with it.
Luke, what do you, and I guess this requires you to sort of put them on the couch, but I talked to some of the folks involved in the Dominion lawsuit, and they're stopping at nothing. I mean, they're going through and deposing basically the lineup of Fox News and everyone behind them. What fuels, I mean, it comes at grave reputational damage outside the coup plotting, club. It comes at extreme financial repercussions, and it feels like the effort to hold them accountable to various bar associations is sort of catching up to the disreputable legal conduct. How does he keep getting people to work for him?
Well, it's a range of things. We've been taking a look at some of the Trump financing, and some of the lawyers are paid quite well. Others are not paid at all. We know, for instance, that John Eastman had requested something like $10,000 a day to keep pressuring Mike Pence and pushing forward some of these legal theories for Donald Trump. And we haven't seen that he was necessarily paid for that from the filings. But in John Eastman's own words, what he said was that he had staked his professional reputation on the idea that the election was stolen. And he felt he had to go out and prove, facts be damned, that this was a stolen election. And so he felt the need to keep pushing on that. And I think some of these attorneys did come out early making these false claims and then felt they had to try to somehow back them up. Others, maybe there's some, I'd have to analyze them a bit more or interview them at length, but maybe they felt there was some professional benefit to being associated with Donald Trump. There would be for other presidents, it would probably be prestigious. But in this case, I think there's been a lot more backlash than necessarily benefit.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew Weissman, they turn into sort of lowbrow criminal defense lawyers, and nothing against the defense bar. Most of them come from a very principled place as former public defenders who move into the space. But that's not the profile of a Republican private practice lawyer. They hold themselves out as former prosecutors who are on the side of the law. This book of business enabled a coup against the United States of America.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been a defense lawyer as well as a prosecutor, and everyone's entitled to a defense. But the question is how you do it. And here, when you as a lawyer are representing things from your client that are false, even if you're not doing it knowingly, you are becoming an instrument of your client's crime. And that is something that, Christina Bobb is going to be in a world of trouble, as we've talked. It's either going to be her or it's going to be him. In other words, it's either her or it's the person who said, don't worry, I've done the search, which has got to be, Donald Trump. And this is exactly what happened, for instance, in the Manafort case, where he made representations to the Department of Justice that were quite similar, saying, I don't have any documents, I fully complied. And he had a lawyer do that. Well, the chief judge of the D.C. District Court, who is involved in this, in the January 6th case, issued a ruling saying that lawyer can now be a witness against Paul Manafort and can relay certain things, such as the representation that you made to the Department of Justice. Where did you get that information? And sure enough, she had to testify and said, I got that information from Paul Manafort. And so there is a roadmap here for lawyers now being interviewed and being turned into witnesses against their client. And it's rightly so. If Donald Trump is conveying this false information to be relayed to the Department of Justice, or as we've talked about just a few minutes ago, to the court to say I've declassified everything, when in fact he obviously didn't. Those are false statements, and he can be prosecuted for that.
Asha, it is a more, without Luke and Mike's reporting, it's a more opaque piece of the MAGA assault on the rule of law, but it feels like a really important one. And the truth is that if you take Trump's pardons and how he corrupted that process, and you put it next to lawyers like Don McGahn, he was a sitting White House counsel. He didn't want to go talk to Robert Mueller. He didn't want to talk to Weissman or he didn't want to talk to the obstruction investigators. He was, it was reported at the time, afraid of being a party that was obstructing justice in the larger investigation into the Trump campaign's ties to Russia. How are more of them not concerned with the kinds of things Don McGahn was concerned with?
Nicole, I have to believe that this cult of loyalty around Trump is just something that is really hard for us to understand because we see so many people fall prey to it. This idea that loyalty is above everything. And we know that that is Trump's highest value. If you go back and read Mary Trump's book, which is fascinating, this is really the culture that he was brought up in and then one that he creates around him. And it's, I think, partly the need to be loyal, the fear of being ostracized and what that would entail. And apparently for lawyers, the idea that this could impact their livelihood appears to not enter the equation. But I'm glad you mentioned the pardons too, Nicole, because there's also, I think, this implicit promise of some kind of reward where, you know, maybe down the line, if they're successful in all of these efforts, that anything they do that transgresses the law will somehow be erased. And if you look at Trump's history of pardons, what does he pardon for? He pardons for process crimes, obstruction of justice, for perjury, for contempt of court. He doesn't believe in those rules. And I think that it's sort of this very strange, internal culture and infrastructure that he creates that makes this possible.
And again, Claire, he takes this norm, you know, what Andrew and Luke said, that everyone is entitled to a defense, and he perverts it. He's the rule breaker. He's the one ordering people to break the law on his behalf, holding out in lots of instances. Luke's paper did some great reporting on the pardons that were promised if people broke the law and enforcing the southern border. I mean, he does it all in full view. What do you think gets sort of respectable lawyers to still sign on?
Well, there is this idea that it's prestigious to work for someone who is president of the United States. And then there's also lawyers who support Donald Trump. But here's the problem for lawyers. You know, I know everybody in America thinks all politicians lie. They don't. Donald Trump, that's the main thing he did. He doesn't believe that telling the truth is a value. He thinks it's more important to lie when you need to hold on to power and to get what you want and to have everything look good for you. Now, lawyers are taught that you can really get in trouble and lose your law license if you lie while doing your job as a lawyer, if you lie to the court, if you lie to law enforcement. So there's the rub. If you're going to represent a liar who doesn't think there's anything wrong with lying, then you've got to have a bright line that says, hey, I'm not going to lie for you. I'm not going to lie for you. That's why I think these pleadings don't say that he declassified the documents, because these lawyers don't want to lie for him. So it will be interesting to see how this all turns out. Now, the lawyers that were willing to lie for him, Giuliani's been disbarred. He's a target of a criminal investigation. Eastman admittedly was pushing a scheme he knew was illegal. Bob signed a document which either he lied to her and she believed it, which she should know better because he's a liar, or she lied. I mean, the ones that lied are in trouble. And that's why I think these pleadings are such weak tea, because I think the lawyer that's representing him now doesn't want to lie.
Amazing. Amazing. Luke Broadwater, thank you for the reporting and for joining us to talk about it. Asha Rangappa, Andrew Weissman, thank you so much for starting. There is some news today on the return of those highly produced, incredibly compelling public January 6th committee hearings. NBC News has learned that the next one is likely to be held on September 28th. The panel is expected to meet tomorrow to discuss their next steps, which could include how many fall hearings we should expect, and lots of major endgame decisions ahead of their final report. Meanwhile, over at the Justice Department, the New York Times says that two top political aides of the twice impeached ex-president were among more than a dozen people to receive subpoenas in the probe into the fake electors plot and post-election fundraising, dubbed the big ripoff by the January 6th Select Committee, including none other than the former presidential advisor and speechwriter Stephen Miller, who talked about an alternate set of electors on television in December 2020, and who the Times says was among those paid by Trump's super PAC since he left the White House. Joining us, Jackie Alamany, Washington Post congressional investigations reporter. Also joining us, Tim Miller, writer-at-large for The Bulwark. Claire's still here. Jackie, you're all over this story about the select committee on the investigation at DOJ. Tell us what to expect first on the congressional side.
Yeah, Nicole. Well, there has been no formal notice from the committee yet. They've said previously that they were going to reconvene in September, and we are expecting at least a handful of hearings before they go back home again in October. But members do return from recess tomorrow, where they're going to likely spend the next week sort of feverishly hashing out the plan ahead, as they did spend August sort of picking up loose ends, putting them together, interviewing some people and witnesses and targets that they previously had not been able to get in contact with, or new people that came forward or sort of materialized out of the previous investigation and the interviews that they had conducted ahead of the summer series of hearings. We do know that over the summer they also have subpoenaed a few people, including most recently Newt Gingrich. They're also expecting more documents to roll in. We just reported a few weeks ago that in the wake of the Mar-a-Lago raid of the FBI raid to recover boxes from Trump's home and club, that Mark Meadows did documents to the National Archives that had been requested by the January 6th committee. So things like that, sort of, again, these loose ends are being played out. We know that members are going to be working until the bitter end. We were told that at one point, some members were even Googling the latest possible day they could hand in the final report in order for it to be actually processed by the Government Services Administration. And I imagine tomorrow, once we see all these people back in action and in person again, the sort of the pace is going to pick up where they left off.
Jackie, do you have any sense from your reporting whether, because I asked Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren if the focus shifting and the Klieg light sort of turning to the Mar-a-Lago surge, if that aided them and let them sort of work under the radar in a way they were not able to do in June and July. She didn't really answer me directly, but I wonder if you have a sense that either the focus on that or the acceleration of the Justice Department probes have made things easier or harder for their work of the last month?
That's a really good question, Nicole. And I have been really searching for this sort of nexus that I feel like must be there between the Mar-a-Lago search warrant being executed and the investigation into Trump's mishandling of classified documents and the January 6th investigation. So far, we have not really found anything explicit there. But one thing that has been sort of interesting that has come out of my reporting in the last few weeks is that you've got to wonder whether or not the January 6th committee should get some responsive documents from the documents that have been obtained by the FBI, and whether this pause due to the special master might impact their investigation in some way. Again, as we all know, the committee made a sweeping and broad request to the National Archives for any and all documents related to January 6th over a year ago. And based on the volume of documents that have been recovered from Trump's Mar-a-Lago, there are members who do feel like they want sort of a thorough search done to see if there are any documents that would be relevant to their requests and should be turned over to the committee. But again, there are some sticking points here, as that investigation is now currently in sort of in a stalemate until the special master situation is figured out. But I do think that the DOJ investigation and the Select Committee investigation have done a pretty good job, the January 6th DOJ investigation, of being complementary and working in tandem. We do know that, according to Chairman Thompson, that transcripts have started to be handed over to the DOJ. But it does seem like at the end of the day, the Select Committee was pretty ahead of the curve on their evidence and intel gathering.
That is so interesting. And Tim Miller, it certainly makes sense. We've never had a president plot a coup before and run a fake elector scheme. But if you plot a coup, maybe some of what you steal are your coup plans. I had not heard that before, that's an open question, but it certainly makes sense.
Well, sure. You don't know, right? I mean, we've seen the pictures, the top secret documents, and, you figure at least some of them are just mementos that the egomaniac former president wanted to keep, the letters to Kim Jong-un or whatever. But what else is there, I think, remains to be seen. I have the meticulous reporting of my friend Jackie over there, what's happening on the Hill. But I've talked to some friends who are working for members on the committee, and they haven't spoken specifically to this issue about the Mar-a-Lago raid, but they do feel like there's more material left that they have to show this fall, right? Despite the fact that they told a pretty complete story over the summer, obviously there were a lot of different elements to this, right? And what was happening with other cabinet members is a big question, a big part of that. I think we're going to hear more about the kind of discussions of the 25th Amendment and who Trump was pressuring during this period, and whether he took additional documents, I think is also an open question. It's relevant also. You mentioned the lead in the New York Times story today about Stephen Miller and Brian Jack having to testify. Brian Jack is a name maybe the viewers might not know, but I think it's a potentially important nexus here, because he went from being political director at the White House to being Kevin McCarthy's political director, right? And so this kind of question of how much coordinating was happening, not just on the alternate slates of electors, but between the White House and Rudy and Trump's Kevin, et cetera, trying to get their members to vote to overturn the election. Brian Jack is right there at the center of that. And so I'm interested to see, what that might produce.
I want to ask both of you about that on the other side. And as you're speaking, Tim, I'm reminded of what Liz Cheney said in one of the final public hearings of the summer. She said to her Republican colleagues in the House specifically, the stain of your dishonor lasts forever. So for that to be part of the investigative unveiling of their final report is a pretty good guess. All right, I need you both to stick around through a quick break. We'll dig into what Tim just mentioned, Stephen Miller's subpoena and the others and what they mean. Don't go anywhere.